All right, number 4 of the OWASP top 10 is XXE. It stands for XML external entities. And this one sounds scary. Not many people really know what these are, and this is a relatively new vulnerability on the list. But let's start by defining what XML is. XML means extensible markup language. It's another markup language similar to HTML. Except it's made specifically for storing and transporting data. HTML is only designed to display data, for example. So HTML for displaying, XML for actual transport and storage of data, say in the database or going over the network, exporting and importing data, something like that. Here's an example of a very simple XML file. This is just describing a message that has a to and a from field, and then a subject field with a message, and a subject field with the title, and a body field for the actual message. In this case, this is describing an object that is a message from Gary to Quinn, saying or asking, "Where are you?" XML also allows for something pretty dangerous called external entities. And I had no idea what these were before just about a year ago, but basically what they are is they're tags in an XML document that you can use to include external files into that document. And you can also put in URLs there, so you can include content from a specific URL as a resource in your XML. And why this is dangerous is because those inclusions of those external files and URLs are processed on the web server where it's being parsed. So if you have in your application where you're importing XML documents for data, a malicious user could put an external entity. Say they could put the name of a password file that they know exists on the web server for that external entity, and then send that to the server. It gets processed and parsed, and the server includes its local password file in that XML, and that could potentially be displayed in the browser or just simply returned to the user. And in that case, the attacker would get that dangerous file from the server. Here's an example graphically. The attacker is shown as sort of a vampire, which is appropriate because he's siphoning something from the server. So he's sending a malicious XML document to the server and getting potentially secret files, emails. The possibilities are endless. And like I mentioned, you can also include a URL in those external entities. So a malicious attacker could send an XML document with, say, URLs for internal resources on that victim's network. And this could be a totally automated process as well. An attacker could create a script to send these requests to your server to just do some recon and map out your entire internal network. They could also use it for just numerous other things. So let's talk about the impact. Obviously, it can lead to data leakage from files from the server. Another thing it can lead to, I didn't already mention, is denial of service attack or DOS attack, which is where the server is just taken offline. Attacker could also recon the server's corporate network, which is really dangerous because usually internal resources aren't protected nearly as much as external facing resources. So there's a lot of vulnerabilities to be found internally on a corporate network. Another example here, this is just showing the actual XML file code that the attacker would insert to make a malicious XML file. So this is an example of putting a known location to the password file, and this is on a Linux server specifically. That file stores the hashes of all the passwords for the users on the system. So it's really bad if the user gets a hold of that. So in this case, this is an entity tag. And the second field here, my XXE demo, that's just the name of the entity. And this is arbitrary. You can put anything in here. That doesn't matter. The third field here, the third item is system. And this just tells it that it's a system resource. That's actually the really bad part of it, is that it's a system entity. This is specifically the type of entity we want to watch out for. But it can be used maliciously. And so it's just passing the file name @c/password. So that will be included in the XML document for when this is processed on the server. This is an example of if the attacker wanted to probe the server's private network. You can see that's an internal IP address there. So this is going to try to include that resource on the server's internal network into the XML file and then return it to the attacker. So then the attacker can know, does this exist and does this have content here? And then they could run various other attacks after that, after doing that kind of recon. This is an example of a DOS attack using XML external entities. The file included here on a Linux system, dev/random, is actually just a endless random file that it's kind of hard to explain, but basically if you do something like cat/dev/random, you're going to get endless random output. So this tells it to include that random file into the XML. And as I said, that's endless output. So the server is going to be stuck processing this at full speed forever, if essentially taking it offline and crashing it. That's pretty easy to do. There's also something called a billion laughs attack. And this is something that was discovered in 2002, but this is just taking advantage of those external entities. There's a lot to what's going on here, but essentially each line here just multiplies the number of times the output of lol will appear in the XML document. So yeah, all it's doing is printing out this lol9 entity, but each one of the lol9 entity has 10 lol8 entities, and each one of those entities has 10 lol7 entities, and so on. So this just causes a denial of service attack on the server as well, and it crashes. Oh, I just realized that I haven't put the link to the slide deck in the chat yet. I'm going to put that in chat so that anybody that wants these slides or to download them or anything can. So jumping on to the next vulnerability type is number 4. We're going to talk about prevention of external entities. The simplest solution is to not use XML in your app. It's a lot easier than you would think. XML isn't really the preferred transport type anymore. JSON is a lot more common these days. And that's for a lot of reasons, but also another is just because this external entity's vulnerability in XML. That doesn't exist in JSON. JSON is also less complex, less overhead. It's just more widely used today. The main actual way to prevent this, if you have to use XML, and try to avoid it if all possible, but if you have to use a modern XML processing library, so if you're using XML in your app and you don't know what kind of library you use, you might want to find out and look up that version and everything specifically on Google, and maybe find the GitHub and see how recent it's being developed, if it's being developed by anybody or maintained. If it's not, you probably want to switch to another library because it's probably not safe. So use one that's tried and true. As I said, Is it still maintained? And definitely keep it up to date. If there's a new release of your XML processing library and you have access to your web server to update it, then update it. Read the documentation for that XML parser as well. They all have their different ways of configuring it and disabling any features. For example, feature-wise, you can actually just disable external entities and DTD processing in your XML parser. These days, most of them allow you to do that. Some of them actually just have them disabled by default. Almost nobody uses external entities in XML. So these are pretty safe to turn off. And if you don't know if these will break anything in your app, try turning them off in your parser and then save that change and try using the billion laughs attack or something against your server. Validate XML before parsing. And that sounds kind of weird, but obviously you don't want to just throw a user input XML document at your parser without doing any kind of validation, because it might have something malicious in it or unexpected. There might still be new ways to DOS attack a server with XML that we don't know of yet. So reference the XML security cheat sheet from OWASP. It's pretty good, it's really extensive, and goes over the topic a lot better. But as I said, the easiest way to prevent this is simply don't use XML, use something else.